to BCTV members, to the Magic Lantern members, and also to the Cinema Theatre Association members. And these not all, but to the alumni and staff of the University of Westminster, for whom we wish to thank for providing this wonderful historical venue for this lecture. I just want to give you an idea how it came about. Last year I was at Oxford University at a seminar there, and on the same bill was our friend David, and he actually impressed me no end, as I'm sure he will you, in delivering a lecture which I'll always remember. And as a result, we got together, and here we are this evening. So a warm welcome to you all, and I hope you enjoy the evening's proceedings. May I now introduce to you David Clover, our lecturer for the evening.
My gallant crew, good morning. Sir, good morning. I hope you're all quite well and beautiful. I am in reasonable health, and happy to be with you once more. You do us proud, sir. Boom, boom. The last time I gave this talk, one person in the audience had been to see HMS Pinafore and knew the response. It's not a criticism of this audience at all, but I shall try it every time, and we shall see who the people are who know they're going to consult with. I'm going to put the microphone on because I've had a throat infection, and this is a bit like when the priest rose up in the church and you suddenly say things in the vestry which you didn't want the congregation to hear. I've put this film up to start with because it has nothing whatsoever to do with Alfred West's Our Navy. I welcome this evening, by the way, David Lee from the Winchester Sound and Vision Archive, who worked with my father through the 1980s and 90s, assembling information about Alfred West from the family archive. And lots of what you'll see this evening comes from the family archive, but we now have the internet, of course, and the internet has provided a fantastic source of material. Another fantastic source of material has been the collections of William and John Barnes. William Barnes, the very celebrated early film historian, with us this evening. Absolutely thrilled that he's here. And we have a collection of a few of his artefacts after the event. We're going to a room along there, and you'll be able to see some of the things that William has brought with him. You'll also see George Malcolmson's collection of postcards, which we used to illustrate these films contemporaries at the time. And Lester Smith has brought his magic lantern. Of what vintage is it, your magic lantern?
1880, 1890.
An 1880, 1890 magic lantern. It is now, in fact, powered by electricity rather than acetylene gas, so the London County Council doesn't have to worry about the safety issues. And we shall be showing you some lantern slides interspersed. Let's talk about this film first of all. It was discovered in well, actually, I've forgotten exactly where it was discovered. David, you'll remind me. But it was discovered in a fairly bad condition, and somebody went through the whole film, frame by frame, rephotographed it, and turned it into this fascinating procession. It's fascinating because it's the longest piece of film we have, which we know is almost certainly taken by Alfred West, and it was never ever used in any of his presentations. There's just one brief reference to the event itself in one of the advertisements that I found. But this was never ever shown as part of the Our Navy presentations. It actually depicts a procession of Freemasons, as you can see, going to the opening of St Matthew's Church in Portsmouth in around about 1902. We think that's about the date of it, when the church was opened. That church was bombed and blitzed during the war, no longer exists. So this is a picture of the congregation and the Freemasons attending that ceremony.
And it is actually quite fascinating. As it's been running all the time that you've been sitting there, you've probably watched most of the things happening now. There are some fascinating things going on. Fixed camera, hand cranked, and I suspect probably used as a home movie for the Masons' next lodge meeting. I can't think that it really had any other function in Alfred West's canon than that. So, without more ado, I'm going to move to the presenting rostrum. And we're going to stop that one. A little bit of computery stuff in the back, I apologise for that. I don't think I want to know about that. So, this is our man, Alfred West. He was really a photographer and a cinematographer from the period 1881 to 1913. 1881 is a significant moment because it coincided with him being old enough and interested enough in technology to start working with photography, and also the advent of the dry plate. And the dry plate made instantaneous photography possible. It hadn't been very straightforward before. You had to make a wet plate, and it went off after 10 minutes, so it was really very difficult to take decent photographs with that technology. But with the dry plate, suddenly things became possible that hadn't been possible before. Here's Alfred West. He's my great-grandfather, and he was born in 1857 and died in 1937. He was a photographic artist, and he created this incredibly important Our Navy series, which ran, and this is what excites me very much, it ran in this exact hall from 1898 till about 1912, 1913, 26 weeks a year, 2 performances a day, prices in the front 3 shillings, towards the middle 2 shillings, and towards the back 1 shilling, and the gallery probably 6pence. In 1881, where the story really starts, this is the West household living in Gosport in Southsea. George West, head of the family, he's 65. He was a carpenter and joiner by trade originally. George West, his son, aged 40. Mary West, 38. And you'll see in a minute, this is quite an interesting list. William West, and you'll see the occupation, photographer, photographer, photographer. This was a family of photographers. That's all they did was photography. Alfred West, 22. Mary West, not started with photography yet. And there was a general servant living there as well. As far as I know, and working out as best I can from the current addresses in Gosport High Street, that's actually the studio that they work from. As you see, it's not a studio anymore. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a shoe shop anymore, to be honest, but that is the location in Gosport where the business was carried on from, Eagle House. And in addition to that, there was a separate part of the business in Palmerston Road in Southsea. So in Southsea, there was a large house called Roselle, and in the grounds of the house was this little place called the Anchorage, which still exists. That's a photograph of the gate. I went to see it the other day. And that's where he had his operations, his studio, his international operation, which you hear about a bit more in due course. So, I don't know if anybody knows, any Portsmouth people here? I know George is Portsmouth, Gosport, you can tell. So there's the map of the Southsea, there's the going down towards the castle at the bottom there, and that's where Alfred West's house was and still is, and that's where his shop was. So getting up in the morning and going to work was terribly difficult. From the 1880s, once this dry plate process was available, studio portraits were the most important thing that happened in the photography world. If you look at catalogues of that period, there were lots and lots of photographers, enormous numbers of photographers. Everybody wanted to have the family picture taken, as today. But rather than have these electronic cameras that we have now, or even the film cameras, Instamatics, this was how it was done. And the collectors of these pictures, and George Malcolmson is one, do make a study of all this material. And interestingly, each item has a number on the back of it, which makes it a little bit like a stratified layer, if you like. If we knew the date of one of them, we might be able to work out the date of another one from the number. That's something that people do try to do with these photographs, sometimes called carte de visite. There's another one of a handsome hussar, probably off to the Boer War in due course. The West family, I can use this apparently. There's our man Alfred West. This is Ted, a little older. This is William, and this is George Jr., standing in their studio, I suspect, having the family photograph taken. They were family photographers, they had to make sure they did a good job of it. So then they put their hats on. These two photographs were sent to me by my cousin Eric West in Vancouver, who I spoke to this week. He's very interested in this talk. He's got quite an archive of bits and pieces from the period. Those are the four West brothers, and the company was called G. West and Sons, I should say, G. West and Sons. And they were the sons. But interestingly, there are 4 sons, and there are 5 daughters. So there's 9 in the family altogether. The daughters don't get mentioned on the business card at all, but there they are. And in fact, of these, Maria and Mary Ann certainly started their own photography businesses as well. One I think in Bournemouth and one I think in Godalming. I'm not quite sure about that, but there were certainly branches of the family who spun off from these Wests. So Alfred writes a autobiography, which I have here. This is Alfred West's autobiography, never published, typed out by my father, Anthony Scott Clover, in 1936, and proofed by him. It's a fascinating book, and it doesn't tell us all the things we really want to know, but he tells us about how he started. He says in 1882, he was at Cowes, it was all very beautiful, Queen Victoria was in residence, and he starts taking pictures like this. And these pictures were taken from a moving boat, probably a sailing boat, actually on the Solent. These are some more pictures. And he writes this in his autobiography, which I think is quite interesting. He got a photograph of the Bacchante, and this must have been in the 1880s, I suspect. It was a warship. And Captain Ballaston of the Royal Yacht, and I've looked him up, he was with the Royal Yacht quite a long time, saw the picture, took it to see the Prince of Wales to look at it. The Prince of Wales said, "This is a jolly good picture, I desire to meet the photographer." So he actually made royal connections very early on through his skill. And because of what he was doing, and not many other people were doing it, he became very, very popular with, it seems, the royal family and with his lordships and the Admiralty and all those people. That's a picture of HMS Bacchante. I actually can't say that it was taken by Alfred West, but it's certainly contemporary. That's the kind of ship which is confused as to whether it's a steamship or a sailing ship, and that went on really right through the end of the century. Alfred West describes how he made his pictures. And he had a yawl, which is a sailing boat. You'll see a picture in a minute. He slung his camera in it. It was a sailing boat. He hung a big weight from the camera, mounted it in the boat, and then had a wire frame over the top, which he pointed at the boats and pressed the shutter. That's a picture he drew himself of the boat, the yawl, and you can see the camera is mounted here in the well. It's I should know the rig, but I don't quite know. It's a ketch, I think. And here's a picture, again by Alfred West, of he would put the camera here. Here is a weight slung underneath it. The whole thing tilts about, as you see. And because he had to take instantaneous photographs, he actually invented his own wooden shutter. Don't forget his father was a carpenter, and he probably had some of that skill himself. So he made this very neat little shutter, which there's a hole in the middle, there's a slider, and there's an elastic band, which you just release, and the elastic band flips down over the hole and makes an instantaneous exposure. And he built that himself. And he was one of the first people to invent the instantaneous shutter. As a result, when he submitted his pictures for competitions, there was great doubt as to whether they were genuine or not. They thought that perhaps they didn't have CGI in those days, but there was great doubt as to whether they were genuine. So this was one of his early pictures, a yacht by Lord Cecil, and he said that the judges did not believe that it was not elaborately retouched. This is the study, this is the picture, and that picture is taken from a sailing ketch on the Solent. He's actually on the lee stern quarter, so you can probably be fairly safe in that position. And there's Lord Cecil looking over the stern, asking who that photographer is, get me a copy of the print. I can almost guarantee it. We think that picture was taken in about 1884. And to be able to achieve that level of instantaneous photography at that time, with a dry plate, with the ingenuity he exhibited, I think is a great tribute to his skill. He put these photographs into competitions, international competitions, and this is his own photograph of the medals that he was awarded as a result of his photography. We'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. The medals that were held by Alfred West are in fact in Australia. My cousin Simon West holds those medals, but he has very kindly sent me some examples, and here's one. Now bear in mind, this is a photography competition, and the artistry that's gone into the medal itself is really quite remarkable. Photography was a very highly regarded art at that time, and a person such as West, who was at the top of the profession, clearly highly valued. This is 1883, and this is the Newcastle upon Tyne and Northern Counties Photographic Association, and that's the other side, awarded to Messrs West and Sons for yachting studies. This is another one. This is the Photographic Society of Ireland, and once again, an extraordinary piece of metalwork for a photographic competition. And this is one that they won. And there we are, awarded to Messrs West and Son for instantaneous yachting views, 1884. So these are the medals that he was competing for, these extraordinary photographs. And that's a photograph from my cousin Simon West in Australia of the complete shelf of medals that he won. I would love to have a black picture of every single one of them. They are beautiful works of art. In 1884, he took what became one of his most celebrated pictures. The yacht was called Mohawk. It was an America's Cup contender. You'll be familiar with America's Cup, I'm sure. It's changed very much these days. They use catamarans, it didn't in those days. And this is a picture that he was incredibly proud of and really went all around the world. In taking this picture, you'll see in a minute, there's a piece of rope hanging down. The piece of rope went right over his head, nearly knocked his hat off, and you have to bear in mind this is photographed from a small sailing ketch with a camera mounted in the well, Alfred West with his elastic band, and hopefully this, I pressed the wrong button. You'll see a bit better in a minute. That's an original print made from the original plate by Alfred West, contemporary with the picture. And that picture hangs in my cousin's house in Plymouth, and just for some scale, there's the lights on the stairwell. She has to buy a big house with a big stairwell in order to put this picture in. She says she hasn't moved to a house yet, but she can't fit it in. This was in my grandmother's hall, I remember, when I was a child, and we used to walk past it. We'll now just see something a bit more, hopefully. These are some of the critiques that were put in the photographic press at the time. And that is this extraordinary study. And it's just worth bearing in mind that Alfred West is sitting in a sailing ketch over here somewhere. He's on the lee bow of a boat which you cannot stop. These boats do not stop. In fact, if you go to the Solent now, you can actually see the J-class yachts, which have been restored from the 1930s. They are absolutely huge. They just go along like a train. They don't give way to anything. He's sitting in his yacht here. His skipper is bringing him right under the lee bow. There's no telephoto, of course, in those days. And this piece of rope here is flying. It's an outhaul. It's flown away from where it's supposed to be. And you'll see that there is a man in the rigging here who's gone to fetch it. And that lends that picture the most astonishing sense of drama. If you want to know exactly where it is, it's in Southampton Water. It's a race. It's actually winning a race. If you know Southampton Water, you go down there on the Red Funnel Ferry. There's a little castle over here called Hurst Castle, and that's exactly where it is. In fact, he's even on the side of the shore, which is the shallow bit. So, you know, when he says he was nearly killed taking some of these pictures, I think you can see. This was a quotation that he gave to the Magic Lantern magazine, for which I must thank Lester very much for. If you pick that bit out. This is what Alfred West says. The camera is fixed, so that no matter how rough the sea is, it can be levelled at the object to be photographed. If the shutter is fired, it seldom fails to take a good shot or picture. Pictures from that period continue to be found. I get emails sometimes because we're on the internet, and this is one that was sent to me a little while ago of these three boats, the Navajo, the Colonial and the Satanita. These are all America's Cup type boats. They would compete for the honour of racing the America's Cup. And this picture is an original print. I've got a current copy of it, and during the war it was actually split. There's a great big split right across the middle because a bomb landed in Cowes where it is, and it split it, but I've actually mended it with some electronic stuff. But this is an original print. So then we move to the later period when he starts to work with film, which is really where the story takes its next spot. And he had clearly accumulated a very large amount of money from the photographic business. You can see, if you want that Mohawk picture now from Beacons of Cows, you will be asked to pay £140 for that print. That's the sort of money that's being paid for them now, and it's equivalent in those days as well. He developed his film, his moving film, by hanging it over a line to dry, and he didn't have any spooling, so he wound it in by hand. He didn't understand about how to join film together, so his film was in what was called ribbons, and you'll see later on that when he presents to Queen Victoria, she actually talks about the ribbons of film being shown. But the particularly interesting thing is after they've been developed and fixed, they wound them around a drum of slats and put a row of gas jets to dry the film out. Has anybody actually ever worked with nitrate film? Have you ever seen nitrate film exploding and burning? It is quite remarkable to me, the things that happen. There's even a story that says that he was showing a film at the Portland Hall in Portsmouth, and the film came off the reel, and it was just piling up on the floor. A pile of nitrate film in a crowded theatre, much more crowded than this one. Health and safety in those days was not a big consideration, but having said that, the regulations did start to get tightened up very quickly in the late part of the 19th century and early 20th, which we will talk about in a minute. So that's how he processed his film. I put this in just now because although it's actually from 1911, it's the only photograph we have of Alfred West actually wielding a camera at a ship. This is actually the 1911 Fleet Review, which was done for the coronation of King Edward VII. And that is undoubtedly Alfred West madly winding his camera with his hat on backwards, clearly moving, the movement on his leg there. And somebody who knows about these things actually identified the ships for him. So in about 1897, because he had this contact with the Admiralty and the Royal Connection and so forth, he was asked if his company could help the Admiralty in looking at how torpedoes, guns and mines worked. And this is an early lantern slide. I don't think you've got this one, Lester. Probably not. This one actually comes from William and John Barnes's collection. It's actually in the Hove Museum, and I photographed it there. And it's very interesting. You can see that it says West-South Sea here, so this is undoubtedly Alfred West, who was the South Sea person. And these are in fact mines sitting on the floor, and this is a diagram showing how the mines are laid in a pattern. People who understand undersea warfare, and we've got George Malcolmson here, can tell you more about what that actually represents. But these were taken for the Admiralty and used by them to document the work that they were doing with that sort of thing. Now these are slides that Lester does know about, but these were taken again to show what happens when a Whitehead torpedo is launched. This bit here, by the way, is called the lower boom on the ship, and you bring your longboats alongside and the sailors climb up these little ladders and run along the top to get aboard. So those are some pictures taken at the time. This is what's called a spar torpedo boat. This may or may not be by Alfred West. It's so much like the pictures we're going to see in a minute, I'm almost certain it is by Alfred West. What you do is you get this boat and you sail it up as close as you can to the enemy, and you prod this stick at it and you explode the mine on the end of it, and that's how you bring the ship to grief. I have to say that by the late 1890s, it wasn't the most favoured method of warfare, but nonetheless, there it is, and it forms one of the earlier and undisputed shots that we have. Now, hopefully, if I can manage it. I thought you'd gone quite a long time without seeing anything moving, so this is one of Alfred West's early shots for the Admiralty, showing what happens when a torpedo is launched, which is exactly what you'd expect, really. It goes in the water and it blows up. But actually, there's a bit of cutting there, because obviously that wasn't taken in the same moment, so he's cut the two scenes together to show what's happening. And actually, torpedoes don't really do that anyway. Torpedoes hit other ships. So that's actually a mine being exploded. In 1898, the Duke of York, who became King George V later on, was given command of HMS Crescent, which was a cruiser, and he made a 9 or 10 week tour as captain. As today, the royal family liked to dress up in military uniform, and in the case of the Duke of York, this was the Navy, and he was trained as a naval officer, and he was given command of HMS Crescent, which sailed around with the family, and on board were taken Alfred West and his trusty assistant, Chief Petty Officer McGregor, and they took films and photographs on that cruise When they came back, they showed them to the crew on the dockyard wall. They all lined up on the quarterdeck and they all watched the film going on. And the Duke of York said, "My mother would like to see these." So what they did was they took them to the Osborne House. They put a screen up between in a doorway between two rooms in Osborne House, and they showed the films. And very kindly, the Queen, I have to say this because I was asked in a letter to say this, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has kindly allowed me to include this quotation from the Duke of York's diary, which is actually in the Royal Archives at Windsor. So we know it happened, we know that it was very well done. Now what they did was they interspersed, because the film ribbons were too short, you hadn't joined them together, so the lantern slides were interspersed between the cinematograph ribbons. And the Queen said she'd seen a lot of films which were very bad, very jerky, very muddy, but this in fact was much better than the sort of thing that she'd seen before. It's a quotation from the optician in September 1898. That is HMS Crescent. It's actually passing Fort Blockhouse at Portsmouth Harbour entrance. I don't know if that's an Alfred West picture, it's not credited, but it's the kind of picture that would have been shown as part of the display. And there is the programme, which was actually given to Queen Victoria to hold in her hand at that very first Royal Command performance. And he did use the word Royal Command in describing what he'd done. So I think we can say that Alfred West had one of the very first Royal Commands. And you can see that lantern slides by Mr. McGregor, lights, lime lights by Son, so animated photograph by G. West and Son. And here we have the programme. I'm not going to read the programme out in detail, but you'll see that there's a slide, there's an animated photograph, their Royal Highnesses, there's a slide, there's a further slide, and so on. So really that's when Our Navy show was born, because having this privileged access and having done the cruise of the Crescent, he thought, well, I think I'll have a go at showing these publicly. That's a photograph taken during the cruise. I think it's a wonderfully posed photograph of this wonderful roadwork here. This is actually a contemporary review of the presentation at Osborne, which we have got. I don't actually really have original copies of these. This is all come from photocopies and microfilm, because that's gone out of the family. In 1898, therefore, he hired St James's Hall, Piccadilly, to show the cruise of the Crescent films, which had gone down so well. The Navy League, which was an organisation devoted to promoting the future operation and the development of the Navy, was there. There were admirals there. And he had sound effects and music, and this was really quite novel. It was a 2-hour show, and the seats went from 5 shillings to 1 shilling. And we're talking about 1898, and if you do the sums, that's actually quite an expensive and prestigious show to go to. The stage was decorated. This stage here should have had Union Jacks up the side, possibly a white ensign, and possibly large pot plants on each side. There'd also be a lady, who would be the lady singer, to cover any gaps in the presentation. And there were gaps in the presentation. It was one of the first shows. There were a lot of problems with the lighting, not enough light coming forward. There were problems with the lantern slides being held too long, one of the criticisms. And one of the early film pioneers, Cecil Hepworth, is believed to have helped him sort all this out, technically, at the time. Now, interestingly, this business of sound effects is fascinating. Now, splashing, realistic words of command, splashing of waves, sheets of coarse sandpaper to rub together gave a realistic enough impression of the splashing of waves. Now, we do have a couple of sheets of coarse sandpaper in the hall. Could you give the impression of waves? So my son, William, can you give the impression of waves, please, William? There we are. Okay, you can feel the water. I think slightly knife. Well, of course, those of you involved in the film industry know that rubbing sheets of coarse sandpaper together, or I understand getting custard powder to make the sound of polar bears' feet, is something that you do all the time anyway. So he really had all these ideas long before the industry did. This is, I think, a representation, possibly not an accurate one, of this exact hall at the time. Here's the presenter talking about it, rather like me. Here are the chaps behind the scenes making thunder noises, hitting drums, rolling cannonballs on the floor, possibly dropping cannonballs out of a box, I'm not quite sure, crockery. This is all going on behind the scenes. And here's the projector, and here's the show. And there's the Union flag hanging to show the nature of the performance. And this is probably this building, but there's a bit of poetic license in terms of the artistic representation of it. This is actually the playbill for that very first show, and you can see how much he's playing on the fact that it's the crescent as shown before the Queen at Osborne, under the patronage of the Navy League. He talks about some of the topics, the content in there and so on, and the Turbinia, the fastest vessel in the world, going at 35 knots. Yachts racing, we've lost all this stuff. Sofa stalls, 5 shillings. Doors open 7:30. In 1901, there was a further cruise where the then Prince of Wales took a cruise liner called the Ophir. They put HMS in front of it, it's like a white ensign on the back, and they sailed around the world, and they took the redoubtable CPO McGregor with them to film it. That's actually not a West picture, it's actually a picture painted by one of the crew, Harry Price, in a book, rather interesting book of the cruise, but that shows the ship that they went on. And he took these to Sandringham to show to, by then the King, of course, King Edward VII, and these are the telegrams that passed between him and Sandringham. You can see Sandringham there, saying that it says, come to Wolferton Station by 12:05 and so on. Then a bit more information about how I shall set it up, and then a final telegram with the word snap on it. He sent this back to his house at the anchorage because he said, if I send the word snap, it means it's been a success. So in Portsmouth, he showed at Portland Hall, in London, St James, and in London, of course, this particular building, this exact room, the Polytechnic of Regent Street, now the University of Westminster, and he would have stood exactly where I'm standing now to give his presentation, and I think that's really quite remarkable. There's one of the early advertisements, you may have seen one when you came in from the Portland Hall South Sea. And there's one of the early advertisements of the Polytechnic, and again, great play made of the fact that it was a Royal Command show. This was the kind of advertisement that you would see in the newspaper. And all over the country, it doesn't matter where you go, you will find references to these shows. This is actually collected by a scholar called Rosalind Leverage from the West Country Press. So what happened is that in 1902, he sent his Captain Edwards, which was his staff member, and G.H. Snazzy Snazel, who was an actor of the best sort, who was looking for something to do, and he spent about 9 months or so learning how the R Navy shows worked. They travelled to Australia with all the kit, and think about what that involves, on the SS Orizaba. He was a baritone, he was an entertainer, he was an actor, and Captain F. Edwards also gave presentations. There's a picture of the ship they travelled on, the Orizaba. And that's a picture of G.H. Snazel. You recognise him, nodding going on there. We have a G.H. Snazel historian here, by the way. We can give the next talk for you. And these are some of the contemporary references, don't read them now, but these are contemporary references in the Australian newspapers, all wonderfully digitised, which makes it so much easier now to do research into these periods. This was an advertisement in one of the newspapers saying how long it was going to go. 10 weeks in Sydney, 6 weeks in Melbourne, 10 nights in Bendigo, wherever that is. And these are some of the newspaper articles about Mr. Snazel returning to Australia and how he was going to do it. That's actually one of the posters that was used during that tour in Hobart, and I got that from the internet. I don't have the original, but that's one of the posters made at the time. What were the films about? And this is always the interesting thing. None of his narrative films survive, unfortunately, but one of the big themes was taking the boy from the choir in the village, leaving home, waving goodbye to his mother, saying goodbye to the priest, the parish priest, the vicar, who would give him a note to take to the chaplain of his naval station. And these are the kind of pictures, the stills, from that sequence that he had. This is the mother saying goodbye to the boy in the train. This is the boy actually arriving home again on leave. It looks so much like a set, actually, that it doesn't bear any resemblance to a real place. But there he is coming back. And of course, you always have to wear your blue jacket and naval uniform when you're having tea with your mother. Here he is on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory. The picture is called Fitted for His Uniform. Clearly every boy joining the Royal Navy went across the water to the Victory, went to the quarterdeck and was measured for their uniform as a matter of course. And this is a picture of the Greenwich Naval College, the boys at the Greenwich Naval College, what do you call the cradle of the Navy. You can see him rather better there, being measured for his uniform underneath. England expects that every man should do his duty. And these are the bases, these are the films you would have seen in this location in about 1898. There's also a romantic interest, which we don't ignore. Now, having made these films, he had to have a market for them, so he showed them himself, but he could also make up sequences and send them off to other exhibitors. And this is a sequence called the Russo-Japanese War, which was shot, as far as I can tell, I'm only guessing really, but it looks a bit like it, in Portsmouth Harbour. And in order to make it look like the Russo-Japanese War, he had to make one of the ships look Japanese. So you'll see, when I press this button here, I want you to watch this flag here. You see the Japanese ensign. But just towards the end, you may not spot it, there's this tiny flick where it wasn't an ensign anymore. You'll see that in a minute. So the first frame actually has a big blank flag. Further frames have got a rising sun painted on to the 35mm stock. And frame 52 very clearly shows the white ensign. And I think that's Alfred West's little joke. I think Alfred West has sold this film for this presentation of the Russo-Japanese War, but he's just made quite certain that nobody thinks it's really Japanese because he's too proud of being British. I may be making this up, but it just seems too much of a coincidence that it should be towards the end of the film where it just suddenly becomes the white ensign. Obviously, you're not going to make this kind of material without having a cultural background going on. And I only recently discovered the work of a writer called Harold Begbie, who I think is rather interesting. He's a kind of a slightly sub-Kipling poet, actually quite good in its way, patriotic poetry, which you'll see in a minute. The Boer War was taking place at the same time, and in particular the Siege of Ladysmith had taken place, and the Siege of Ladysmith had involved a naval brigade taking field guns across hostile territory, inventing as they went as sailors how to take a gun on land and relieve the Siege of Ladysmith. And this became a very important cultural reference point. Rudyard Kipling, of course, and poems, recessional, things like that. The Morning Post, in fact, uses that. Mr. Alfred West has accompanied with his pictures what Mr. Rudyard Kipling has done in story and verse. And the patriotic songs of the period. It's perfectly clear when you read through the programmes that the business of the film was interspersed very frequently with songs. Some of the songs, I would have to say, are not the kind of songs we'd sing now. They're not even the kind of songs that would entertain people very much. But Mr. Snezell sang this song in Sydney. Mr. Organist, please. respiratory tract infection, which is causing my top notes to go a bit funny, as you've probably heard. But that's the kind of thing that you would have seen at an Our Navy presentation, whilst they changed the film, or whilst they started up the projector, or whatever they happened to do. Here is the front cover of the Harold Begley book, and it's called The Handyman, and these words, the handyman, appear quite often in the West literature. And what Mr. Snell would also have done is he would have read out this poem. I'm just going to read the first few lines. We've seen him dragging his guns along in the agricultural hall, trotting about in the soundless town as if he were playing at ball. But none of us saw him in farn a towel, tugging away at his load, though ruts in the road which the rain had cut, and where there was never a road. Handy afloat, handy ashore, easy as soul to please, ready to straddle a merry-go-round or ride on the plunging seas, son of this sea-girt England, ward of the world-wide breed, Jack is the man for the midnight watch or the hour of the Empire's need. You would have heard recitations of that sort. This one, the Navy's Cradle, you'll see referred to a bit later on, and I'm not going to read that one out, but this provided the basis of one of his sequences. The one, in fact, set in the Greenwich. Now, how do we know that some of this stuff is by Alfred West? The National Records Office at Kew has these documents, which are fascinating. They were, when you wanted to register a piece of film or a photograph, you filled this form in, tucked a bit of your photograph onto it, and that made a copyright for you. And these were nitrate sections of film, and they were discovered in the museum at Kew, at the archive in Kew, what, about 10 years ago, David, I think, probably. Maybe a bit longer. David Lee knows more about this. And they discovered that all these priceless records full of paper were stuffed to the gills with bits of nitrate film. That was actually rectified rather quickly, and the nitrate film was photographed and stuck back on them, and the nitrate film is now in the National Film Archive, of course. Here's an example of it. And down the middle you can see that sequence of film. Now this does enable us to take that sequence and reanimate it. I've done that there. I've taken that sequence of film and I've reanimated the film from those frames. And that's how we can see a few of the little bits and pieces of clips from that period. Here's another one, Jack and his sweetheart. This is a film about the Entente Cordiale. The plot there was that I think Jack wooed various different people, but always under the British flag, so it doesn't matter what country they came from. They said under Union Jack when they were kissing. Here are a few of them. These are again taken from these copyright assertion sequences. You see, they're never going to meet. And whatever it is they're looking for is never going to arrive. It's rather haunting when you think about that. And you'll see this sequence later on as well. This is a field gun drill in Whale Island. This one is a sailor. So he went down to the skating rink in Portsmouth, gave all the sailors skates to put on, and then just filmed them falling over. And this is a huge hilarity. It's something people love to watch. One of his staff, James Adams, invented a new mechanism for film transport. This is quite important because in the early days, the Pathé brothers held the most important patents for the advancing of film frame by frame. So a lot of the inventors tried to invent new ways of doing it to get around the patent, and this is the one that his member of staff, James Adams, worked on. I'm not going to go through the sequence with you, but you can see the general idea. So here we are at the Polytechnic. Here is the kind of advertisements that were going on from the period 1898 to 1912. By 1898 to 1909, I think this is the fascinating thing, only about a year after he started, he had 50 staff, and I think to build up that operation of 50 staff is quite amazing. And he wasn't just a one-man band showing in one place. Every part of the country had these shows. They went across to Canada, to Australia, as you heard, to India. His son went to India. He didn't find anybody to go to South Africa for him. He went to Belfast, Dublin, where he was rather badly received because of the nationalist issue. When he went to Canada, he had this enormous flag made. You can't see the size of it here, but it is quite enormous. It's much, much bigger than any flag ought to be. And he asked the captain of the ship, as they were approaching Quebec, St. Lawrence, would you mind hoisting our Navy flag? And they said, yes, fine. And they hoisted it up, and the captain looked out of the bridge and said, oh, God, I didn't realise it's that big. So he was a fantastic promoter and showman. This is the Polytechnic at the time of Alfred West's Our Navy and Our Army, expanded to Our Army, and that is from the Westminster Archives, and I'm very grateful for that. He had ways of advertising what he was doing, and I've got one in his book here. This is actually a small paper parcel containing a further piece of paper, but it's actually designed to look a bit like a Beecham's powder. If you're familiar with Beecham's powders. In those days, they were supplied in little blue envelopes, and when you open them up, you would tip the powder into your drink, and then the problems of the night before would go away very quickly before your eyes. But actually, when you opened it, inside, rather than being... Sorry, I've got a kid. Yeah. I can do that. Will it work? Hang on, I'm going to show you. This is technical stuff. You know, epidioscope? Anybody ever used an epidioscope? I think it's a modern version of that. If this doesn't work in 35 seconds, we might do it. I think it's too much. Don't bother, go back to the screen. Okay. So when you unpack that, I'm not going to unpack it because it would damage it. There's just two left from the period. Inside it would be this advertisement, and he would leave them in pubs, coffee places, buses, park benches, goodness knows where. People would pick them up thinking they got a seltzer powder to take, and then they, oh my God, look at this, how amusing. This is actually in Bournemouth, so that's another place that he would have left them lying around. He won a prize for these, in fact, which is not good. This is also this is one from George. Thank you for George. This one, little promotional medal which you can give the children to take away after they see the show. We should actually make some of those, shouldn't we? Using the souvenirs for the tour. And cigarette cards, and again, afterwards, George Malcolmson has brought his collection from the period, so you'll be able to look at them in real life. Often cigarettes. Postcards, a whole postcard series of scenes, mostly scenes from the presentation, some a little bit fanciful. Cameras. I know nothing whatsoever about Alfred West's cameras. It's very frustrating. His book tells us absolutely nothing about it. He says he had new cameras every year, but he tells us nothing about the makes. So I've thrown in a 1905 Alfred Darling camera, which I photographed in the Hove Museum, because it's a bit like the kind of camera he would have used. And you can actually see him here in this shot with a camera very similar. This is Alfred West. His hat's on the correct way around this time. And he's filming possibly at Hillsey in Portsmouth. We don't quite know where that picture's taken, but it's almost undoubtedly Alfred West with his camera, just caught about to film a military evolution. In 1905, he was the natural choice for providing a presentation at the Albert Hall for the 1905 commemoration. It wasn't called a celebration, by the way, it was called a commemoration because we were friends with the French by then, and the French were quite closely involved in the event itself. But he was given this very handsome bust, which I still have in my house on the mantelpiece, which was given to Alfred West in commemoration of his work there, and you can see it's actually Mr. Alfred West, and it was given by the British and Foreign Sailors Society. And in fact, these carried on being given as gifts. They obviously made too many of them up until about the 1930s, and they reused as presentation items. And here is the playbill, as far as we've got it, for that actual event. And some of these people are quite famous. Mrs. Tree was the wife of Beerbohm Tree, the actress. There's others there which are quite famous. In 1912-13, he stopped work with films. But before he did that, he made up a catalogue. This is a fascinating catalogue, and again, David Lee at Winchester has digitised this, and you can find it on the internet. Every single sequence that he could remember, he'd written about, he's actually put into this publication. And that's the first page of it. Yours faithfully, Alfred West, is how he always signed himself. I've done that on the pamphlet that I've given you. Here's his flag from the Canadian trip. Here are his medals, very proud of them. Over 2 million people have visited the Polytechnic, Regent Street. I worked that out. It was something like 400 people a day for 14 years. I'm not completely convinced that is the right number, but he's put it in anyway. Here are some pages showing what we've lost. These are some of the sequences. You can see the length in feet of the sequence there. And you can see descriptions. This is the Harold, sorry, I'm back. This is the Harold Begbie quotation here. H. Begbie, Trafalgar Road in Greenwich and so on, which is how I discovered it. Again, there's a copy of this in the room where we have the refreshments afterwards, so you can read through it if you want to know a bit more. This is the sequence about the boy returning, paying his last respects to his dead mother, who died as well. This is the trysting place, and so on. This is the bit about the Entente Cordiale, a blue jacket sitting down fast asleep, pretty girl dressed as a French peasant steals up behind him, and so Jack wakes up with a warm yawn, and so on. So these are the kind of pages which we have got telling us what the films were about. We just don't have the films. The effect on recruitment for the Navy was fantastic. This is a quotation from an old sea dog in the early 1950s saying that he'd seen these rain-splashed pictures, monkeys, dexterity of monkeys, old sea dogs, a film of photographers at Portsmouth, and he says, Commander Ronald Strudd says, it shaped my life. And this was the effect that this film had on people, and quite intentionally so. He never received a penny from the Admiralty for any of these films. It was a purely commercial venture built on patriotism that he felt he would express. I tried to work out, roughly speaking, how much he must have brought in as money, and this, just by way of reference, is the room we're standing in now. This railing here, around the top, is preserved in the corner. You can't see it, but in the corners behind the screen, there is just that little bit of railing left from the original building. The rest of it was remodelled in 1911 and then later on in the century. But that's the room that he would have been in. These are clearly the flags, these are the Our Navy decorations, and these are what the seats cost. And if you do a few sums, and I've done a few sums, if you multiply it out to sort of 2011 prices, that's bringing in about £9,000 a week. You've been in the cinema and film business yourselves. I don't know if that's a good taking for a week for a small operation, but I think it probably is quite good. So if you work out a 25-week season in this building, that's equivalent in today's money of about £223,000 for the season. And don't forget, he's also showing in all other parts of the country and abroad. So I think over the 15-year life, just based on this building alone, in modern money, he probably got about £3.5 million of income from the work just in London. There was another West, T.J. West, often confused. In fact, I had to write to a website owner the other day, professor actually, not at this university, another one, who'd actually wrongly attributed T.J. West as A.J. West. They didn't really trade on each other's reputation, but you might have thought so. In some of the West Country advertisements, Rosalind Leveridge has found that he actually, T.J. West, had not connected to any other organisation, so we hope that's okay. But confusion still occurs, and he, T.J. West, had his own business, which eventually went toward Australia. Fantastic showman. This is a photograph in the Barnes collection, in William Barnes's collection. It's the marketplace in Reading, and down in the corner here, there just happens to be a little showman's plate. I mean, look at it carefully. There it is. This is actually sold as a postcard for people going to Reading, but they get an Our Navy advertisement thrown in anyway. People are interested in this period and doing research into it. So Rosalind Leveridge in Exeter, who I've had correspondence with, has written up in her PhD thesis a fair amount of this stuff. Russell Baldwin, University of East Anglia, has done some research. George Malcolmson does research into postcards. There's the Barnes collection, which is mostly in Hove Museum, but some of it's with William Barnes in London. And the most interesting thing of all to me, the Internet Movie Database. You're familiar with this, I'm sure, the IMDb, some of you probably use it.